Hey, what's up guys? Welcome to my complete and updated Nahida guide. Nahida, the Dendro Archon, is a 5-star Dendro character who provides you with a ton of utility, Dendro application, and damage, being an incredible support, being used from both off or on field in a plethora of different teams. And so in today's video, we're going to cover everything you need to know about Nahida regarding the best ways to build her and play her best artifacts, weapons, teams, constellations, playstyles, and so much more. As always, before we begin, I want you guys to know that I do stream most nights on Twitch, link in the description if you're interested. And with that being said, let's talk about Nahida. Alright, so starting things off, what does Nahida actually do? Well, if you don't know by now, Nahida is an incredibly powerful and very valuable Dendro applier, support character who gets a lot of value from her entire kit, especially her elemental skill and passives. Before we get into that though, I want to first start by saying that because she's a Dendro catalyst, all of her normal attacks will be Dendro infused. She can apply Dendro with her normal charge and plunge attacks, meaning that while she's primarily a support character, you can also use her on field if you don't have a DPS in your team or want someone to apply more Dendro from on field. With that in mind, the main part of her kit is definitely her elemental skill. This ability will mark enemies all around you if you press it, or basically anywhere in a very large range if you hold it. In fact, if you hold your elemental skill, which you usually will be doing unless enemies are right next to you, you can mark enemies within your sort of camera lens as long as they sort of pass into the frame. You can do this really fast, like spinning your camera all around you to mark all of the enemies that you're fighting. While you can go too fast and accidentally not mark an enemy, and it does have a range limit, for the most part, the range is very big and you can still go relatively fast when spinning your camera around, and it also can mark up to 8 opponents at once, meaning that for the most part, you can always just mark everything you're fighting very easily and very quickly with this ability. Now, what this mark is actually very important. This mark, called the Seed of Skanda, will not only start by dealing Dendro damage and applying Dendro onto enemies, but will then reapply Dendro and deal damage anytime you trigger an elemental reaction. This can be triggered up to once every 2.5 seconds, and there is no internal cooldown on this Dendro application, meaning that each time it triggers, you will reapply Dendro, giving you a huge amount of Dendro application, typically just the most from off field, assuming you are proccing Dendro reactions, which makes this mark so valuable for basically any team where you want to be spamming Dendro reactions. While how much Dendro you're applying will obviously depend on how often you can proc reactions, this for the most part will almost always be just a lot of Dendro. The damage you deal will also not only scale on your attack, but also on your elemental mastery. There's an additional scaling, meaning that a lot of stats you're going to be building, like crit, damage percent, attack, and EM, will all be taken into account from your skill. On top of that, elemental mastery will also buff your reaction damage if your Nahida procs a reaction such as spread or bloom. The mark that you apply on enemies lasts for 25 seconds, which is a super long amount of time, and your skill only has a 5 or 6 second cooldown depending on if you press or hold it. This ability is absolutely insane and the core part of your kit, dealing decent damage and applying a ton of Dendro on all the enemies you're fighting, provided you are triggering reactions. Moving on, Nahida's elemental burst is also a pretty nice one. This is an ability that will buff your elemental skills mark based on the elements you have in your party. If you have a pyro character or 2, you will increase the damage of this mark every time it triggers. If you have an electric character or 2, you will decrease the interval at which it does trigger. So instead of it being able to proc once every 2.5 seconds, with 2 electric characters, for example, it'll be up to once every 1.9 seconds. With hydro characters, it will extend the duration. And this is an ability that will last for 15 seconds on a 13.5 second cooldown with a 50 energy cost. It is therefore very easy to get back, and it has a really good uptime. Now, these buffs, while they are nice, are typically not the biggest deal. The damage bonus your Nahida will be gaining is cool, but not the most relevant part of your team's damage. The extension is usually irrelevant, and the Electro one will allow you to apply more Dendro, and this can be especially relevant in certain teams with a lot of elemental application, but sometimes it can be arguably too much Dendro, although for the most part, it is beneficial. Where this burst really does become very useful though, is with your first Ascension passive that will give your active character a huge elemental mastery buff, up to 250, as long as you are inside the field generated by your elemental burst. In fact, you'll gain 25% of the elemental mastery of the highest party member in your team, up to 250 EM if you have 1,000 on your character with the most elemental mastery. A lot of the times, you might actually get 1,000 on your Nahida, for example, for quite a few reasons. In fact, not only will you increase your reaction damage, your skill damage, and also cap out this passive, but it will also benefit your Nahida's build through her next passive that will convert her elemental mastery into damage bonus and crit rate. This is a really useful passive that gives your Nahida a lot of damage and allows her to get up to 80% bonus damage and 24% crit rate if she has 1,000 effective elemental mastery. Now, the reason I say effective elemental mastery is because for this passive talent, the bonus damage and crit rate your Nahida will gain will be based on how much elemental mastery she has, factoring in any buffs you get, like for example, the instructor set, Sucrose, Gilded Dreams, or any other elemental mastery buff. Because of this, it can be easier to get 1,000 elemental mastery than you think, but more on that in the build section, where we'll cover how much you actually want to go for, whether or not you need 1,000, and when other stats can be more optimal. For the most part though, just know that Elemental Mastery is a lot more efficient to get on Nahida thanks to this passive talent, and you will also buff your on-field character's Elemental Mastery through your Elemental Burst based on the highest party member's EM up to a bonus of 250 Elemental Mastery. While in some teams that don't care about reactions, this may seem useless, in basically every team where you're running Nahida, giving your active character 250 Elemental Mastery will greatly increase their reaction damage if they are proccing anything like Aggravate, Spread, or virtually any other reaction. There are some situations where, for example, in a Hyperbloom team, your Hyperbloomer may be off-field, so they won't benefit from this EM buff, but your on-field character will typically still be proccing at least one or more reactions, so the EM buff is usually relevant, with its strength varying based on your team. Because of this, the value of your Elemental Burst will actually vary heavily based on your team and how much you can make use of these buffs that you're getting through its own effect and your first passive. I do want to emphasize that sometimes using your burst is not needed if you can't make use of the Elemental Mastery for your on-field character, but as I said, in most teams, the EM buff is very nice and sometimes a big DPS increase, and the additional bonuses from your burst, depending on what party members you have, is a nice bonus but nothing too crazy. Typically though, I still recommend using your burst most of the time, but do understand that it isn't the most crucial thing for every team. Generally speaking though, Nahida's pretty straightforward, a very efficient Dendro support or even on-field driver who gets a lot of value through her entire kit and especially her elemental skill, an incredibly powerful mark that gives you so much Dendro application. Before we talk about her playstyle and a bit more information about her, I want to say that for her talent priority, definitely maximize and prioritize your elemental skill as the most important thing. After that, if you're playing her off-field, it is also worth leveling your burst if you are using it, and as an on-field driver, then leveling your normal attacks is also quite important. Now regarding Nahida's playstyles, there are mainly two. As I said, you can either run her from off-field as a Dendro support or on-field as more of a Dendro driver. From off-field, you mark all the enemies that you're fighting, constantly apply Dendro to them as you trigger reactions, and can also use your burst if you want to. It's recommended to for the most part, but not mandatory, to give your on-field character a huge elemental mastery buff on top of getting the other benefits to your elemental skills mark. Nahida can also deal a surprising amount of personal damage thanks to the way you're going to be building her on top of the damage you'll be gaining that gives you a ton of damage bonus and crit rate. The other playstyle is using her on field, where you'll get even more Dendro application through your normal and charge attacks, which will be Dendro infused because you're a catalyst. In many teams where you don't have a driver or are running really powerful off-field sort of burst DPS or sub DPS characters like Xingqiu, Kuki, Yelan, Fischl, or many others, you can actually just use Nahida as your on-field Dendro applier, who will give you a ton of Dendro application and allow you to spam any Dendro reaction. While there can be some on-field Dendro characters that'll have more personal damage, like Alhaitham for example, Nahida gives you a lot of application and still a really good amount from off-field, which typically makes her the go-to and best Dendro support, at least the best offensive option in almost any team that needs a Dendro support character. Because of this, she's so invaluable as a support, a really powerful Archon that I genuinely really like, although there are replacements for her if you don't want to get her, but Nahida applying such a good amount of Dendro if you're spamming reactions oftentimes allows you to run her as the only Dendro option in teams where you otherwise may need two Dendro characters just to get enough Dendro application. This is the case in many Bloom, Hyperbloom, or Burgeon teams where Nahida can be a great solo Dendro option, giving you a lot of Dendro application from off-field or even way more from on-field, which can be particularly strong in certain Nilou Bloom, Hyperbloom, or Burgeon teams, as I mentioned, but again, more on that later. Nahida can also be a great battery thanks to her mark generating particles passively as you proc reactions, which can even be nice for certain other Dendro characters you may be running, like a Dendro carry such as Alhaitham. Nahida is also super easy to use, super easy to build, as there are many different build paths and so many teams where she's a great option. In terms of weaknesses, there aren't that many. Like, she's sort of squishy, and I'd say the main one in my experience is in multi-wave content. Like if the Abyss has 2 or 3 waves of enemies and you're playing a team or a character where you don't want to swap out very often, for example, you're inside of Cyno's burst or Alhaitham's burst and you want to stay on field for a long time, if you clear whatever enemy you're fighting and there are new enemies that spawn, swapping to Nahida to remark all the enemies may not be something that you want to do, as you'd be, for example, canceling your Cyno's burst. Now, some teams can alleviate this if you can swap around freely, but do note that in some multi-wave content, reapplying Nahida's mark can be annoying, but this isn't really as bad as people make it out to be. It's just something to be mindful of, and it is telling sort of how good a character is if this is their biggest weakness. Another thing I wanted to point out is that because her Dendro application is so strong from her elemental skill, not to get into the nerd talk, but while most forms of Dendro application will be 1 U of Dendro, Nahida actually applies 1.5. Basically, you just need to know that it's a lot of Dendro. This means that removing the Dendro aura on enemies can be difficult and a bit annoying if you're trying to swirl another element. For example, if you mark an enemy with Nahida and then use an Electro ability like Fischl's E, swap to your Nemo character and swirl instantly, well, the Electro that you just applied won't remove the Dendro aura on the enemy, and then your Kazuha will swirl nothing, proccing something that I call the windy plant reaction, where you swirl dendro, but that's not a thing, effectively doing nothing because that reaction doesn't exist. With that said, there are very easy ways to get around this, like either applying more of whatever element you're trying to swirl, or crucially just swirling it before swapping into your Nahida. You can, for example, use your electro support, swirl it with your Anemo character, and then swap the Nahida and mark the enemies by using your skill. Outside of that, for rotation advice, since we're on the topic of it, you typically will just mark enemies on Nahida basically as soon as possible, also using your burst if you have it available, before swapping out of her and just doing whatever you typically would do on your other characters. If you were to use her on field, the same thing applies, except be sure to swap back into her after using all of your support characters' abilities to weave in some normal attacks to apply more dendro. Overall, I want to take the time to say that I think Nahida is one of the most valuable supports in the game, one of the strongest ones in my opinion, who I really like and recommend for so many teams and so many accounts. Alright, now with all that out of the way, how do you actually want to build your Nahida? Well, starting things off, you'll be happy to hear that Nahida's artifact sets are very straightforward. Generally, for pretty much any playstyle, going for the 4-piece Deepwood Memories is going to be your best in slot to increase your team's overall damage. This is because you will gain 15% dendro damage bonus on the 2-piece for your Nahida, and then on top of that, as your skill hits opponents constantly, you will decrease the dendro resistance of enemies by 30%. You can proc this on every enemy you mark all the time, even from off field, meaning that Nahida will be one of the best users of this set with a consistent 100% uptime. Because of this, while there are other sets that could technically increase your Nahida's personal damage, the vast majority of the time, going for 4-piece Deepwood will be the best option for your Nahida to not only increase her damage, but also and especially increase your whole team's damage. If you're proccing any dendro reactions like Spread, Bloom, Hyper Bloom, or Burgeon, having Deepwood Memories on one party member is going to be essential to capitalize on your dendro damage. Because of this, I highly recommend going 4-piece Deepwood Memories on Nahida. With that said, if you already have 4-piece Deepwood on another character in your team, then other sets become more viable, or if you don't need the set for some reason. For Nahida's personal damage, sets like 4-piece Gilded Dreams for a ton of elemental mastery, or 4-piece Golden Troop can actually be the best. Golden Troop can give you a bit more personal damage than Gilded Dreams, but you lose out on a lot of EM, which will hurt the bonus EM from your passive a little bit, but these two options remain pretty similar in strength. Also, I feel the need to re-emphasize that since we've gotten more and more dendro characters, if you're running 2 in your team or running a support who's already on Deepwood Memories, like potentially your healer, then giving Nahida a more offensive set like Gilded Dreams or also Golden Troop being pretty decent become stronger options for your Nahida, with Deepwood being the general supportive set. Other supportive options that are technically viable include 4-piece Tenacity the Millith or 4-piece Instructor, especially in the early game as it gives you a lot of elemental mastery. And while Instructor can be good on some other characters, even in the late game as a great buffing set, for Nahida, having an artifact set that's not a 4-star set, as there's no 5-star version of Instructor, to get more stats is really valuable, as your Nahida's personal damage genuinely is high as well. Because of this, I mostly recommend the first 3 sets I talked about, either 4-piece Deepwood for almost anyone, or Gilded Dreams or Golden Troop if you want to maximize your personal damage, notably if someone else in your party has the Deepwood memory set already. Similarly, mix and matching 2 pieces of EM and or dendro damage bonus can be okay as well. Alright, now with that out of the way, what are the stats you're looking for on Nahida? Well, there are many different ways to build Nahida. I'm going to try to break this down as simply as possible to make building her for you easy. First of all, you need to understand that Elemental Mastery is great to stack Nahida's passives, give her more reaction damage, and also more skill damage through her skills EM scaling. Because of this, having Elemental Mastery up to 1,000 effective EM can be the main thing you're looking for on Nahida. This is especially true in an off-field build, but even just in general, getting Elemental Mastery is great for this character, as not only will you gain more damage, you'll gain crit rate and dendro damage bonus, but you'll also help give Elemental Mastery to your active party member, which is very valuable in most dendro teams, as your active party member will typically proc very valuable reactions. Now, while 1,000 Elemental Mastery is a lot and seems like a lot, it can be closer than you think, as this 1,000 Elemental Mastery also factors in any EM buffs you may be getting. This can include support characters like Sucrose, weapons that give you a ton of Elemental Mastery that you may be running on your Nahida, artifact sets like Gilded Dreams, or other sources of EM like Elegy, Instructor, or others. Because of this, getting around 1,000 EM can be a bit easier than you think. Also, keep in mind that if your Nahida's on field, you only need 800 EM, as your burst will give you another 200, which would cap you out at 1,000 Elemental Mastery. Additionally, it's worth noting that going past 1,000 Elemental Mastery in almost any scenario, except technically in a Nilou Bloom team, will be mostly wasted, as the EM will no longer be as good as crit or other stats that we'll talk about. What's also important to understand though is that your stat priority will change based on if you play your Nahida on or off field. Off field, stacking this Elemental Mastery till you have around 1,000 effective EM will be your #1 priority. Alongside this though is also making sure you have enough energy recharge to use your burst on cooldown, as while Nahida is valuable even if you only use your skill, your burst is a ton of buffs that you don't want to miss out on, so it's definitely worth using. With that in mind, Nahida Nahida and her teams are generally some that give you a lot of energy, and Nahida really won't be very energy hungry. Many teams can get away with even 0 ER, but typically going for around 120 or 120 to 140 energy recharge is the typical range for Nahida. Personally, I've almost never needed to build more ER on my Nahida in the year or two I've been using her. Keep in mind that using Nahida on field will also help you alleviate your energy recharge needs, alongside running either another Dendro character, which is pretty common, or just characters that generate a lot of energy, like Fischl or Favonius weapon using supports. For the other stats, like crit rate, crit damage, and damage bonus, like Dendro damage on your goblet, these are all very valuable and honestly pretty similar in strength to EM for Nahida. If you're playing Nahida on field, since your normal attacks don't scale on EM and scale on attack and crit, then going for those other stats can be a bit more valuable than EM. However, even in an off-field build, crit and damage bonus are pretty similar to EM, typically slightly worse, but not that far behind to where you should go based on your substats, and they are very viable alternatives. Because of that, for your substats, crit rate, crit damage, elemental mastery, and energy recharge are all nice, with EM being a big priority for an off-field Nahida and also just in general. For your main stats, what you're looking for is, first of all, for an off-field build, typically elemental mastery on every stat, EM on your sands, goblet, and circlet, whereas for an on-field build, you'd be looking more towards still an EM sands, but then for your goblet and circlet, you can start looking for Dendro damage bonus, which will actually be better once again as it buffs every part of your kit, and either crit rate or crit damage on your circlet. Keep in mind that this crit circlet will still be similar in strength to EM, sometimes slightly better, but very similar, and Dendro damage bonus as well will just be a bit better than EM for an on-field Nahida, and only a bit worse for an off-field one. Because of this, you can go based on your substats, but to summarize and not make it confusing, typically stack EM on off-field Nahida till about 1000, with Dendro damage bonus, crit damage, and crit rate all being valuable as well. Make sure you have a bit of ER, and make sure to have a bit of energy recharge to use your burst on cooldown. For an on-field Nahida, stacking elemental mastery is still very valuable, but getting Dendro damage bonus and also crit stats can be slightly better than stacking EM, still very similar overall though. Lastly, in a Nilou Bloom team, while your stats are very similar to an off-field Nahida build, just know that stacking elemental mastery will be your priority, alongside making sure that you can use your burst on cooldown. While Nahida won't be proccing the most blooms in those teams, especially if ran as a solo Dendro, she will still proc the occasional one, meaning that elemental mastery on her will be very valuable. Moving on, for the weapons you want on Nahida, the logic is similar. In fact, there's a lot of really good weapons you can use that give you beneficial stats like either elemental mastery, damage percent, or an effect that will buff your team. First of all, it's important to say that Nahida's signature weapon, 8000 Floating Dreams, is usually going to be her best in slot. If you choose to pull for this weapon, definitely use it on Nahida, as it will give you a huge amount of elemental mastery on its stat, more EM and damage bonus on its effect based on what your other party members are, and also it will give your other party members elemental mastery as well, making it really good for your team's damage. Because of this, it is usually Nahida's best in slot. However, you shouldn't feel forced to get it, as there are weapons that are very similar in strength. First of all, Yai's signature weapon, Kagura's Verity, is actually pretty similar in strength for Nahida overall. In fact, it's usually slightly worse for an off-field Nahida and about as good or sometimes even slightly better on field, at least for your personal damage. This is because you get a ton of crit damage and also an effect that will increase your skill damage every time you use your skill, stacking up to 3 times. You also get elemental damage bonus, which is genuinely really good for Nahida, whose damage mostly comes from her elemental skill. Because of this, Kagura's Verity and her signature weapon are the 2 best 5-star weapons for her, both being great if you have them. Now, while there are other 5-star statistics you can use, before we get into that, I want to say that you don't actually need 5 stars if you don't want to pull for one, as there are really good 4-star options that give you a lot of stats. In fact, elemental mastery options, like notably Sacrificial Fragments, is a great gotcha 4-star that you may have that gives you a ton of elemental mastery, 221 at level 90, and an effect that will reset the cooldown of your skill when it damages an enemy. While its effect isn't that relevant, the elemental mastery is huge and makes it a good stat stick, especially for an off-field Nahida. Similarly, free-to-play elemental mastery weapons are very easily obtainable and also very good, like notably the Magic Guide or the Map Amare, the Magic Guide being a 3-star and the Map Amare being a blacksmith free-to-play weapon. Both of these weapons are similar in strength and give you elemental mastery. The Magic Guide is typically slightly better from off-field, with Map Amare potentially being slightly better on-field, but again, very similar in power level. With that in mind, the Wandering Even Star, which is a more rare gotcha weapon because it's newer and only been on certain banners, is a really good weapon that's even better than a lot of the 5 stars, especially with refinements. This weapon will also give you a lot of elemental mastery, but also have an effect that will convert your elemental mastery to bonus attack for both Nahida and crucially your other party members. This can help buff your carries and also give you a lot of elemental mastery, being a great option and typically the best 4-star for Nahida, especially for an off-field build. Moving on, for weapons that give you a lot of crit, weapons like Lost Prayer, Solar Pearl, Witsith, especially with refinements, Eternal Flow, or even Scoured Atlas for a ton of attack are all decent options, especially on field field for the reasons we talked about earlier, being that your normal attacks will also benefit from this attack and or crit. Widsith is one of the options that I personally like if you're not going for an EM weapon, as it gives you a lot of crit and then an effect that will either give you a lot of elemental damage bonus, elemental mastery, or attack percent, with all of these being very useful, especially EM and elemental mastery. Do note that Widsith is a weapon that gets a lot better with refinement. It's better on field than off field, but in both, it can be nice to help front load your damage if you can make use of the buff uptime, giving it some high highs, being a useful option, although not necessarily the most consistent one, and still comparable in strength to your free-to-play EM catalysts. For more supportive options, Favonius Codex can be great to give your team energy, especially if you're on field and can proc it up to once every 6 seconds with refinement. Hakushin Ring and Electro teams, Thrilling Tales if you want to buff a hyper carry, although your Nahida's damage will suffer, or Prototype Amber, especially when paired with Farina and another sort of weaker healer, and you want a bit more bonus healing in your team, then Prototype Amber can actually be quite optimal in those specific Farina team comps. This is because while the HP stat is wasted on your Nahida, when you burst, you'll give your team energy, which can help you max out on Farina's fanfare stacks and increase your team's damage buff significantly. The Sacrificial Jade is also a pretty good battle pass stat stick, giving you a ton of crit rate as well as some elemental mastery when off field. Naturally, this will be a strong option for an off field Nahida build, but worse on field. With that in mind, for most people, I highly recommend either going for an EM weapon, either off or on field, in general, especially off field, but also being good on field, with crit weapons, notably 5 stars, like Yai's Signature, Widsith, Lost Prayers, or Solar Pearl, all being viable and better on field. This section may have gotten confusing, so I'm going to include 2 different weapon rankings on screen now to give you a general idea of what's better for Nahida, the left ranking being for an on-field build, where you're auto-attacking, and the one on the right being for an off-field, more standard playstyle. Do note that the exact rankings of each weapon will vary heavily based on your playstyle, rotation, artifacts, and team, so use this only to get a general idea of which weapons are good for you. Moving on, I want to point out that Nahida also is a character with really powerful constellations. While I think she's absolutely broken even at C0, so don't feel forced to get any, Nahida has a really strong early constellation upgrade with her second one if it's something that you choose to get. This constellation is one that will give you significant buffs to all of your Dendro reactions. Burning, Bloom, and its sub-reactions, Hyper Bloom and Burgeon, will now be able to crit with 20 crit rate and 100 crit damage respectively, greatly increasing the damage of these reactions in any team that runs them. If that wasn't enough, you also get a 30% defense decrease to enemies affected by Quicken, Spread, or Aggravate, meaning that anytime you run an Electro character with Nahida, which is going to happen in a lot of different teams, the defense of all enemies you hit will be decreased by 30%, which is absolutely huge. Defense Shred in this game is very rare and very efficient at increasing your damage, meaning that this C2 will not only be a large damage increase to your reaction damage, but also a large team damage buff overall, especially if you can make use of this defense decrease. The increase to your Bloom, Hyper Bloom, Burgeon, and Quicken teams is all incredibly relevant, being a significant damage bonus, usually around 20% or so, for your team's DPS, depending on the situation, being a really good constellation and one of the strongest C2s in the game. For Nahida's other constellations, her first one will give you another party member of Pyro, Electro, and Hydro when the buffs are counted for your burst, effectively just giving you more buffs for free, which is a nice passive, but not the biggest deal for the reasons we covered when talking about her burst. Moving on, your C3 and 5 will increase your talent levels, with C3 being pretty nice, and then C4 will be a pretty nice elemental mastery increase to your elemental mastery. In situations where you're fighting 4 or more enemies, you'll gain up to 160 EM and 100 EM in a single target situation, which is nice. It's more stats, but not the biggest deal. Lastly, Nahida's 6 constellation is a really strong one, especially if you're using her on field or spending some time on her on field, as it will greatly increase your Nahida's normal or charge attack damage after using your burst and hitting enemies that are marked by your skill. You will then deal a large amount of Dendro damage, scaling on your attack and elemental mastery up to 6 times per burst cast. This will give you a nice amount of sort of front-loaded burst damage and will increase your Nahida's personal damage significantly if you want to use her on field and actually get a lot more damage out of her. Overall though, I don't think any of her constellations are needed, but if you do want to get one, then C2 is the main one that I would recommend, being a really strong early stopping point that will increase your team DPS in any Dendro team. Alright, now moving on, let's talk about Nahida's best teams. Now, as we saw throughout the video, and as I want to re-emphasize, Nahida is a character who is really good in almost any Dendro team with any Dendro reaction. She applies a ton of Dendro, both from off and on field, is a very versatile and strong support, and has good synergy with most Dendro team comps. With that in mind, let's go into more detail as to how you're going to be building a team with Nahida. So first of all, you can use Nahida alongside a Dendro or Electro carry for a spread or aggravate team, which we're going to be calling Quicken because they're all sort of the same reaction. You quicken and then you spread or aggravate, in which you are using Dendro and Electro units together. Nahida has really good synergy with off-field Electro pliers, Electro supports like Fischl or Yaimiko, but also on-field ones like Kachin Keqing, Sino, even Raiden, or just most Electro units in general, as well as Dendro carries like Alhaitham or Tsehnari. She can be a great battery for them and is oftentimes going to be a key support used in a lot of Alhaitham's best teams. As an example, you can play her in this Quicken variation where you are spamming Quicken as much as possible, or you could weave in a Hydra unit in there and also get some Hyper Blooms. These teams are known as Quick Bloom, where you proc both Quicken and Hyper Bloom, and once again can be ran with a Dendro or Electro carry. You can use Alhaitham as a great Dendro option, or an Electro character like Sino as a good on-field Electro option. In both of these teams, or all of these teams rather, Nahida is a great off-field support who helps give you so much more Dendro. On a similar note, you can run an Electro carry in a purely Quicken or Aggravate team comp, where you run them with another Electro battery like Keqing and Fischl, Nahida as your Dendro applier, and then the last slot is extremely flexible. You can have an Anemo support to buff your Electro damage while also healing you if you want a healer. If not, you can go for a more offensive option like Kazuha or Sucrose over Jean, or you could even run someone like Zhongli to reduce the resistance of enemies. Keep in mind that in this team, you can also replace Nahida and use a Dendro healer or a Dendro shielder, someone like Baiju, Yao Yao, or Kirara, as you don't really need much Dendro application in this team, but Nahida's buffs are still really nice and a great option even in these teams. It's worth pointing out that Nahida can also be ran from on-field with these reactions if you need more Dendro application or just a good on-fielder. You can pair her with incredibly powerful burst supports, sub DPSs like Xingqiu, Yelan, Fischl, Beidou, or so many others that can deal a lot of good damage from off-field while having your Nahida on-field to constantly proc Dendro. In these teams, you want to make sure you have someone to Hyper Bloom, someone building a bunch of Elemental Mastery, an Electro character stacking EM like either Kuki or a full EM Raiden Shogun if you don't need a healer. It is worth noting that there are many other options you can use here. Hyper Bloom teams is pretty much anything goes. You can use characters like Furina, Kokomi, Neuvillette, Ayato with an incredibly flexible last slot as well, provided you just have a Hydra unit, an Electro Hyper Bloomer, and Nahida. On a similar note, you can also play Burgeon teams that follow a similar structure, with the last slot again being flexible. In these teams, you can either have Nahida as your on-field option or run her off-field as well with an on-field character like potentially a Hydra one like Ayato, Kokomi, or Neuvillette. The sky really is the limit in these teams, where the main thing you need to keep in mind is just, do you have enough elemental application? Do you have all the elements you need to proc the reaction you're going for? And then after that, just picking the correct units to fill those team slots. Toma is usually the go-to pyro option for Burgeon teams, but someone like Xiangling can also work very well because of how broken she is. Moving on, Nahida is also a great Dendro option for Nilou teams, giving you a ton of Dendro from either on or off field. If you run her as the solo Dendro option in a Bloom team with 3 Hydros, you want to make sure you're using her on field though to really apply as much Dendro as possible and allow your Kokomi or Barbara to stack full Elemental Mastery and get most of the Bloom ownership. In these teams, you can also run double Dendro though to get more Dendro application and be able to swap around more and not have to spend as much time on Nahida. Nilou has many teams she can run. You can run Nilou with Candace, you can run an on-fielder like Alhaitham, you can run 2 Dendros or just 1 Dendro with Nahida being your on-field option. The sky is the limit in these teams. Just make sure you have a solid healer so that your own Bloom reactions aren't killing you and are stacking Elemental Mastery on whichever characters are going to be proccing the Blooms in your team. This can be somewhat inconsistent, but usually you'll have a dedicated Bloom procker, like for example a full EM Kokomi or Barbara in a team with Nahida on field as your solo Dendro. As I said though, these teams are very flexible and many of them can run 2 Dendro characters as well. For the most part, I'm trying not to go into every specific example here because you can literally run Nahida in any Dendro reaction team, and she's oftentimes a really good choice. She has a lot of synergy with a Dendro carry like Alhaitham, Electro carries, or anyone that wants to spam Quicken, Hyper Bloom, Bloom, or Burgeon. She can also be used in burning teams, although those are less meta, but you can run her with, for example, a Burn Melt Ganyu or whatever other form of burning you choose to go. She can be ran on field or off field, and you can even play a Dendro Hyper Bloom team, even with characters that don't need it. Like you can run Neuvillette with Nahida and Kuki, even though he really doesn't need it. Because Dendro reactions are very strong in general, and Nahida is a very strong Dendro support, there really is so much you can do with her. Also, in case you're wondering, because she is new, Furina also can work with Nahida as your Hydra option. Just make sure you have enough healing. And something important to note is if you're running a Hyper Bloom team with Nahida, Furina, and Kuki, if you want to try to get more healing than just Kuki's personal healing, which can be a bit low, especially if she's on full EM, you can consider something like Prototype Amber on your Nahida, as we mentioned in the weapon section earlier. And so yeah, overall, Nahida is a really powerful and flexible support, and I hope I showed you guys that in this video. With that in mind, I didn't include a showcase in this video because I feel like it's already getting really long, and I tried to include a lot of footage of Nahida and her various teams throughout the video. With that in mind, if there's anything you think I should add, any feedback you have, be sure to put it in the comments down below. If there's anything I want to change, it will be in a pinned comment. And as always, I really hope you guys enjoyed. Apologies for the delay. I wanted to release this video like weeks ago, but it got delayed. But stay tuned for a ton of new guides for new characters and reruns, as well as just general Genshin guides coming out soon. So stay tuned for those. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Hope it helped. And as always, I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.